What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Sorcerer as a healer. So Sorcs kind of have a pretty good spot when it comes to healer. They're not quite as strong as the Templars or the Wardens when it comes to healing ability, but they still make very potent healers, especially in 4-man content, and you can actually bring them to vet trials. They do have a little bit of a disadvantage in that their burst heal does involve a pet, so obviously you're not going to necessarily be able to have that burst heal on every single fight. So there is that weakness there. Sorcerers also lack a source of minor major mending, at least a consistent source of minor major mending, so there is that problem as well. But in general, you can complete all that content with Sorc healers. It just requires a little bit of additional work in order to get things across and to kind of make it work a little bit better. So just like our other build videos, we'll be going over our gear, our skills, our attribute points, our CPs, everything. Then because healers don't have a rotation like a DPS does, we'll be talking instead about what skills you should prioritize, kind of what your rotation kind of should look like, and kind of what you should be really looking for as you're healing either 4-man or vet trials content. So let's go ahead and get things started now with our gear. So, just like our most other healers in the game, we'll be going with 2 5-piece sets, and then we're going to be using unique staves as our weapons. So, just like every single healer wants to do endgame content in the game, you're going to want to go with Spell Power Cure as your 1 5-piece effect, and you're going to want to have this currently in all armor because you do want to have gold on all the pieces, because the 5-piece, the boost to the spell and weapon damage does scale off of item quality, so you do want to have all gold there. So right now there's no way of getting gold Spell Power Cure jewelry. It has not been on the golden vendor yet, and if it is, then you can't trade it, so that's kind of why we're going with all body pieces with Spell Power Cure. So you do need to have access to ICP, or not ICP, the Imperial City DLC through ESO Plus, or just buy the DLC specifically, and run that White Gold Tower in order to get your Spell Power Cure pieces. The second 5-piece is going to be variable depending on the content that you're running and your group composition and what your other healer is running. So for right now we're going with Worm Cult here, but there are other options. You can go with Mending, which it comes from Aether Archive. You can go with Infallible Aether, which comes from any of the Craglorn trials. Jorvuld's Guidance comes from I believe it comes from Scalecaller Peak, which you need Dragonbone's DLC in order to get, so that's another option there. Twilight Remedy is a kind of overlooked set as well. It does boost your DPS a little bit, your DPS's DPS a little bit. Comes from Blockade. It's not quite as strong as the other 3 sets, but it's still a potential option to use. So those are kind of your other potential options you can use instead of Worm Cult. And it's all going to depend on what your group needs, what your group wants, what your other healer is wearing if you're going with vet trials. So play around a little bit. The most common healer setup is going to be SBC Worm and SBC Mending. However, a lot of people have been dropping Worm entirely, especially the very end game that Trials guilds, and instead of go SBC IA and SBC Mending. So that's kind of what a lot of different guilds have been going for towards the end game. In terms of armor traits and armor enchants, for your large pieces, that's going to be your hat, your chest, and your legs. You're going to go with Infused as your trait with a prismatic enchant. That just gives us a little bit more health, a little bit more stamina. It's mostly there for the additional health. So we are giving up a little bit of Magicka. We're giving up about 1.5k Magicka for an additional 1.5k health, and that's well worth the trade-off, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. And then for our small pieces, go with Max Magicka Divines. There's pretty much not too much leeway there when it comes to your enchants there. For your jewelry, generally speaking, you're not going to want to have SBC jewelry. You're going to want Worm Cult, Mending, JG, whatever set you're going to end up using there. So I have all 3 spell damage enchants here, but your enchants are really going to be dependent on the Mundus Stone that you're going to be choosing. So I'm actually running the Atronach Mundus Stone, so that's why I can use 3 spell damage enchants, because I'm getting my regen from the Atronach Mundus Stone. However, if you're going to be going with something like the Apprentice or the Ritual, which gives you more spell damage or increased healing respectively, then you might want to consider replacing 1 or 2 of these spell damage enchants with a Magicka regen enchant instead. Generally speaking, you want to get as close to 2,000 as you can. You can see here I'm sitting at about 1927 enchant regen right now. So I am a little bit shy of the 2k, but I'm confident enough with my healing ability that I have run vet trials with about 16 to 1700 regen and not had any issues at all. So your jewelry enchants are really going to be dependent on which Mender stone you're going to be choosing, and as well as how strong you feel your heals are, and what your sustain looks like and feels like in a trial. And now for our two weapons, so we're going to go with a Resto Destro setup here. So Resto Staff front bar, Destruction Staff back bar. So our front bar here, our Restoration Staff, we have the Master's Resto Staff, which comes from Dragonstar Arena. We have Infused here, but you can use a very there's plenty of traits you can actually use here. So if you want more healing power, you can go with Powered. That's a potential option there. If you want a stronger enchant, you can go with Infused, like I have here. If you want more ultimates, so you can get faster Warhorns, you can go with Decisive. If you feel like you're a little bit too squishy and you want some additional resistances, you can go with Defending. So you have plenty of options here when it comes to traits here. Obviously, the only trait that you're going to want to probably avoid is going to be something like Training, but you can pretty much make any trait work. I have a Weakening enchant here. You have a couple of options when it comes to enchants as well. Generally speaking, you're going to want to have one of your enchants be Weakening, and the other enchants can be a little bit of a flex. I like to keep Weakening on my front bar because this is where I'm going to be doing my heavy attacks, where I'm going to be on the most, so you want Weakening enchant up more often. So your other enchant can be something like, if we swap over to the Destro bar here, it can be something like Shock Damage, which helps improve minor vulnerability uptime, which increases damage done to the enemy by 8%. You can do something like Absorb Magicka if you feel like you need that little bit additional regen there. You can double up on Weakening, so your Weakening enchant's up all the time. You can go with Weapon Damage even if you want to give yourself a little bit more spell damage in order to get stronger heals out. So you do have options when it comes to that second enchant there. But definitely try to keep one Weakening enchant on one of your bars, preferably your healing bar, just for that additional damage reduction on the boss. That's really, really helpful to have in trials, especially in progression guilds. You don't have to use the Massive Resto either. You can actually go with the Asylum's Restoration Staff. Let me see here. Nope. Where is it? Go with the Perfected Asylum or just normal imperfect Asylum Restoration Staff. It's kind of up to you which one you want to use. Masters is generally going to be a little bit more useful because of that stamina return. However, the Asylum Restoration Staff does help out your sustain by a decent amount because you will be using Comet Prayer a lot. That really helps out reducing the cost of things, your more expensive heals like Orbs or your Matriarch heal or things like that. So it's very useful to have. I prefer the Master's Resto, but there's plenty of people who abide by the Asylum Resto as well. So you kind of pick whichever one you feel like is most useful to you. Now for kind of our secondary stuff before we go into skills, I am a Breton here. You can kind of have a couple of options when it comes to racial choices here. Bretons are one choice. They get max Magicka, they have additional spell resistance, which helps out their survivability, plus they get a reduction to their Magicka cost of abilities. I believe it's 3%, so that's pretty useful for healers. Another racial options are like the Argonians. They have additional healing done by 5%. They get max health and they get additional max Magicka. And they have a potion passive, which boosts the amount of resources you get back whenever you drink any potion, which is very helpful for your sustain. You can go with Ultimer. They have 10% max Magicka and 9% additional Magicka regen, so that's really useful. The elemental damage passives kind of goes to waste here, but Ultimer are still pretty good racial option here. Another potential option can be Dark Elves. They get 9% additional Magicka. They don't get any regen passive, however, and they also loot out the elemental damage passive. That doesn't really do you any good as a healer, much like with Ultimer, but it is useful there. As a Dark Elf, you also get 6% additional stamina, which is a little bit helpful in some certain scenarios, but your stamina is so low you won't really see a nice boost from that 6% max stamina. It's just kind of a nice bonus here. For our attribute points, I have 59 points into Magicka and 10 points into health. Generally speaking, you're going to want to be sitting at around 18k health as a healer. So I have 19.2, and that's because I have a Matriarch out. It gives me additional health, but without the Matriarch, let me just desummon it real quick. I'm sitting at, wait for it to update, 17.9k health, so just a little bit under, so you can play around a little bit with your health and your attribute points here. Again, the kind of cutoff that a lot of people recommend is going to be 18k health. It's a little bit more than what the DPS want, and also remember that with 18k health, you're actually sitting at close to like 19.5 when you have an ebb and buff from your tank. So you want to give yourself a little bit more survivability as a healer, because if you go down, chances are a lot of DPS are also going to go down because they're not obviously able to get any heals. While generally speaking you have 2 healers, you kind of want to keep both of them up as much as you can in order to get the most out of the healing abilities. For our Mundus, we're going with the Atronach for the additional Magicka regen. You do have options when it comes to Mundus as well, so you do have some flexibility here. You can go with the Apprentice for additional spell damage that boosts your heals, because heals do scale off of spell damage. You can go with the Ritual, which increases your healing done, so that's also very useful. It's not quite as versatile as Apprentice, because it only affects your healing abilities and not your damage, but generally speaking, your job as a healer is not necessarily to do damage, it's to heal and buff your allies. So you know, the Ritual is a good option if you don't want to go with the Apprentice. And then actually a fourth option that's kind of overlooked is the Thief, which boosts your crit chance. So you're going to get more critical heals off, which boosts the amount of healing that you eventually will do, because you're just getting more critical heals going on your allies there. So you do have some options when it comes to Mundus, and like I said earlier, the decision on your Mundus can influence the jewelry engines that you have on your setup. Now for food, you do have several options here. You can kind of get the general idea here that healers have a lot of flexibility when it comes to what they're able to run. So I'm using Witch Mother's Potent Brew here. You can go with Witch Mother's, which gives us Magicka regen, max Magicka, and max health. Or you can go with another food option here. Another very commonly used food option is going to be Orzagar's Red Hrothgar, which comes from the Hrothgar DLC. You can buy, I believe you can buy the recipe, so you don't need to get the DLC in order to get the recipe. It increases your max health and Magicka regen by a larger amount than what Witch Mother's can give you, but it doesn't have that max Magicka, so your heals are going to be a little bit weaker overall, but you'll have better health and you'll have better Magicka regen if you're going to use Red Hrothgar. So my recommendation, if you're just starting to learn how to heal, is to go with Hrothgar, because it gives you more health and better Magicka regen. And then when you get more comfortable with your healing and the mechanics of the trial and staying alive, you can swap over to Witch Mother's, because while you do lose a little bit of health and Magicka regen, you do get some additional Magicka back, which does help out your healing strength. So start off with Hrothgar, and then when you get more comfortable, you can see about moving over to Witch Mother's Potent Brew. The other thing too is with Witch Mothers, you will only want to use Witch Mothers if you have your 3 prismatic enchants here, because you do lose out on the health. So if you don't have the prismatic enchants here, you're actually losing 1.5k health or so. So you can imagine that drops you down to about 16.3k health, which is definitely not recommended for a healer. So only use Witch Mothers if you have those 3 prismatic enchants on your body. Now going over our skills. So just like with everything else we've covered so far, you do have some flexibility when it comes to the skills you can choose. So this is the setup that I generally recommend here, and I do have a little bit of a clarification on one of these skills here. So on our front bar, this is our Restoration Staff bar. I have Empowered Ward. You can go with Hardened Ward if you'd like, but I prefer Empowered because it does give you and your allies Minor Intellect, which boosts their Magicka regen. So that's a nice buff to have to give to your allies, so it's nice to have that. Healing Springs is going to be one of your primary heals. Comet Praetor, another primary heal. You have your Twilight Matriarch. This is going to be your burst heal. Plus it also does a little bit of damage as well. Twilight Matriarch is actually overall, generally speaking, a better burst heal than Breath of Life, because it heals you and 2 others. Well, it heals the Matriarch and 2 others. So it's pretty powerful as a heal. It's pretty much on par or a little bit better than Breath of Life when it comes to burst healing. And it also has a better range, I believe, than Breath of Life as well. So that's really nice to have. Again, though, it is a pet, so you're not necessarily going to be able to use this in all fights. For example, in Aetherian Archive against the mage, you might not be able to use the pet depending on what your raid lead says. So that's something you're going to want to keep in mind there. This technically is a flex spot, but only for a few fights, like maybe 3 or 4 fights in the game. And then I actually picked the wrong morph here. I didn't mean to choose Dark Deal at all. You're actually going to want to do Dark Conversion instead. So this is going to help out your sustain a little bit. There is a cast time associated with it, so you're going to want to time it so you don't necessarily need to block, because while you're casting you can't block. So you're going to want to go with Dark Conversion, which gives you health and Magicka back in return for stamina. So this is really helpful for sustain. It's much better than Balance, the major skill line, which is health for Magicka. So Dark Conversion is super helpful if you need that additional Magicka regen. Plus, Dark Conversion also procs Exploitation, which gives Minor Prophecy to you and your group, which boosts the spell crit by 3% for 20 seconds. So if you don't have a Mag Orc in the group for whatever reason, then definitely want to use Dark Conversion so you can give your Magicka DPS that additional 3% spell crit. It's very, very useful. For our ultimate here, you do have a couple of options. I'm going with Absorption Field. This is very, very powerful in 4-man content and when your group is stacked up in vet trials because it stuns enemies. Obviously won't stun bosses or elite mobs or anything like that, but it's very useful when you're in trash and you need to stun them so they don't hurt you or your enemies. It stuns them for 12 seconds, which is a really, really long stun, so it's fantastic to use in trash pulls, in trials, and in 4-man content. But the healing is where it really shines because it heals for about 3k every 1 second, so that really, really helps out your healing ability. So that way you can just drop your absorption field and not really have to worry about healing people too much as long as the field is up. That is also on top of the fact that it completely negates any AoE effects that are on the ground, so this is a very, very strong ultimate to use here. If you don't want to use this ultimate though, you do have several options. So you can go with the Restoration Staff ultimate. This is going to be more useful for 4-man content, less so for vet trials because it only heals one person, but it also gives the major force and major protection, which is very useful. It's a very cheap ultimate. It's 107 because you do have that reduction in ultimate cost as a Sorc. So it's a very good ultimate to use for 4-man content, not so much for 12-man. And your final ultimate option here is going to be Barrier, Replenishing, or Reviving. I prefer Replenishing for the additional ultimate regen, but you can go with Reviving for that additional heal. So this is here mainly because you can get the Magicka Aid, which gives you 10% Magicka regen when you have it completely maxed out. But it is also a really nice shield. It's about a 30k shield, so really, really helpful to have. But again, you don't necessarily have to use this. If you do have it slotted, it's generally going to be more for the Magicka Aid than it is going to be for the barrier itself. Now for our back bar, again, you do have a couple of flex spots here. So we have our energy orbs here. This is a must-have for healers. You need to have this skill. It is one of your strongest heals in the game. Plus, it also gives you your allies back resources. So this is your only source of resource return as a Sorc healer. So you're going to want to make sure to definitely get this ability as quickly as you can. Elemental Drain here. So this is, again, our Destruction Staff bar. So this is for the Major Breach as well as the Minor Magicka Steal. Blockade of Storms, this is to help off-balance uptime. They did change the way off-balance works, so there is a cooldown. However, they also double the amount of resources you get back when you heavy attack during off-balance window. So you do want to still run Lightning Wall in order to get that off-balance uptime. That's for the additional resource return, which does help out your DPS. You're gonna have to, if you're using Twilight Matriarch, you do have to double slot it, so this is where you'd go. And then this is a flex spot. I have Boundless Storm here. This gives you Major Resolve, Major Ward, which improves your survivability. Also gives you Major Expedition, which does come in handy if there are any sort of snaring effects, so you can move around a little bit more. But again, this is a flex spot. So you can go with Purge. You can put Purge here if you need, if it's a fight where you need to have Purge up. Stalwart Guard is another flex spot. This you won't really be using this too much in progression guilds. This is more for very high-end, score running, speed running guilds. So you basically guard a DPS and you give them minor force, which boosts their critical damage by 10%. Not really used so much for progression guilds or starter guilds, but definitely more so for very end game guilds like Mechanically Challenged or Dragon's Crest or Blind Luck. Other options: Sanguine Altar or Overflowing Altar. This gives you Minor Lifesteal, which helps out your healing. It heals for 690 every second. Plus you get a very nice synergy in Blood Funnel. You can actually activate the synergy twice if you have Sanguine Altar, because the duration is greater than 40 seconds. So your allies can actually activate Blood Funnel twice when you have Sanguine Altar out. So it's a very, very nice, it's a percentage heal, so it's really useful for tanks and DPS and healers, no matter which role you're doing, because it is a percentage heal. Let's see. You can slot Inner Light if you'd like for the additional Magicka, but it's not really all that useful. You might want to invest in Circle of Protection as well. This is going to be more useful for endgame trials for the execute phases. So for example, against the mage hard mode or against the assembly general in halls of fabrication, where you're going to be stacked together. It gives you minor protection, you and 5 other people minor protection, which is nice for your survivability, but you're not going to be using it all too often. Generally speaking, your tanks are going to be using it more than you will, but it is a nice skill to have just in case you do want that additional minor protection there. And one other flex spot that I failed to mention here is you can actually take out Boundless Storm for one of the other flex. This is going to be more for if you aren't going to be using Twilight Matriarch at all on your front bar here. You can actually go with something like Quick Siphon for Minor Lifesteal, or you can go with Siphon Spirit for Magicka Steal and Lifesteal, or you can go with Healing Ward. This is actually kind of useful here. It's not used quite as often in vet game content, but it can be very useful from time to time. Plus, it's nice to have in PvP if you decide to PvP a lot. Mutagen is also a potential replacement if you're not going to be using Twilight Matriarch or Dark Conversion. This is more used for 4-man content because, again, in vet trials you have to hit this 6 times in order to hit everybody, but it is nice to have for 4-man content there. And that's pretty much it when it comes to your flex spots here. One other ability that I kind of want to mention is going to be Bound Aegis, which gives you Minor Resolve and Minor Ward, which boosts your survivability, and it also boosts your max Magicka by 8%. The downside is you do need to double slot it, so you will have to give up some abilities here, and there's generally not a lot of wiggle room here when it comes to your front bar here. So if you're not going to be using Twilight Matriarch, you can go with Bound Aegis instead for the additional survivability plus the max Magicka. Alright, let's go ahead and talk about our CP distribution. So we have, the cap is 720, which means we have 240 to put across each of the 3 different constellation colors. So let's go started with the green CPs. 75 points in Arcanist and Tenacity, pretty self-explanatory. Magicka regen, and additional Magicka when you do your heavy attacks with your Restoration Staff bar. When I do my heavy attacks on my resto bar, I actually can get back like 20 to 25% of my Magicka with 1 heavy attack, so it's really nice to have 75 points tenacity here. The other 90 points can be split across the remaining nodes however you'd like, depending on your own personal playstyle. I like to conserve stamina, so I have 31 to Shadow Ward, 31 to Tumbling, and 20 into Warlord. That's just me. You can kind of play around with those 90 points however you'd like. For our blue ZPs, the 2 nodes that you're definitely going to want to have is going to be 100 in Blessed and 100 in Elfborn. This is if you're a pure healer. If you are going to be doubling up as a DPS, you might want to take points out of Blessed. Not too many. Probably bring it down to like like 49, 56, something like that, 64, and put a couple points into the other ones. But 100 to 100 is definitely what you're going to want to go for if you're going to go for dedicated healing power here. That leaves 40 points, which you can really put wherever you'd like. I have 27 into Elemental Expert, 13 into Staff Expert to help out DPS a little bit. But, I mean, you could just really put 40 points wherever you'd like, really. It doesn't really matter too much where you put them. For our red CPs, I take a one-size-fits-most approach, so I don't have to shift my CPs around too much. However, depending on the content you're running, you might want to shift your red CPs around a little bit. So for example, if you're going to be doing Mob Blockade, you're taking more magical damage compared to physical damage, so you might want to invest more into Spell Shield, take points out of Hardy, put them in a Spell Shield instead. So, generally speaking, you can think of damage as being split up into 4 different categories: direct physical, damage over time physical, direct magical, damage over time magical, and generally speaking you're going to want to put a little bit more points into direct damage, so Ironclad, and then you're going to want to split up the remaining points however you'd like depending on the content you're running. There are resources out there with recommended CP distributions for each specific trial, so you can probably just Google that and you can find it out there somewhere. I will also be releasing a video looking at specific CP point distributions, red CP distributions for those trials. So for me, I have 66 into Ironclad, 44 into Thick Skin, 2 into Light Armor Focus, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. This is my one-size-fits-most approach. One thing I do want to point out here is you can go with 11 or 31 points into Bastion here for the Field Physician and Infusion passive. They're pretty useful to have. However, as a healer, you won't necessarily be resurrecting very often because your focus is really going to be more on healing the person that's going to be doing the resurrecting. But it's nice to have that option there, but again, it's kind of up to you if you want it. I generally don't recommend picking it up as a healer because you will want to heal people, not resurrect people. Alright, so that's it for all of the build information. So now let's go over kind of what you want to do as you're healing, what your rotation should look like, if you want to call it a rotation. So obviously the first thing you want to do as a Sorc healer, if you're running the Matriarch, is to make sure your Matriarch is out. This gives you additional health, so you can see here I got a nice boost to my health there. So this is going to be your burst heal. This is your source of burst heal. So let's just say this dummy is going to be the boss here. So the two skills you're always going to want to have up on the boss is going to be Ellie Drain. Definitely want to have Ellie Drain, and then Blockade. Those are the two skills you always want to have down at all times. The next skill that you're going to want to prioritize is going to be your two skills are going to be your Orbs and Combat Prayer. Combat Prayer for the Minor Berserk, for your allies, for your DPS. That increases the damage they deal by 8%, which is a really nice boost, so you want to make sure to keep that Combat Prayer buff going at all times. And then obviously Orbs is there for the resources, so I generally want to keep at least 1 or 2 Orbs out in the field at all times, then the DPS and tanks can take them whenever they need. Just pay attention to when your raid lead or DPS or tanks call for more resources. When they do that, just pump out a couple of Orbs, like 2, 3, or 4 Orbs. Because you don't have access to Shards, which is an immediate cast down, you will have to kind of be wary of the fact that Orbs do take time to travel. So let's say, you're back here, the precursor dummy over there is a tank. If they call for resources, take a look at how long it takes for Orbs to get over there. It takes a while, so you're going to want to just keep that in mind there. But the Orbs do have a very long range. You can see just how far they go out. I think you can actually hit the docks from here. So the Orbs are out for 10 seconds, so they'll just keep on floating and floating for 10 seconds until they disappear. So you can see just how far they go out there. Now if you do need to burst heal, then go with Matriarch. Otherwise, just stick with Healing Springs. Especially for 4-man content, and make sure your DPS can all be caught in your Healing Springs. It's a pretty wide radius. And then if you make sure to cast Dark Conversion every 20 seconds or so for the Minor Prophecy. If you got a shield, you got your shield up. And then you can try to keep Boundless Storm up if you're going to be using that for the additional survivability. This lasts for, I believe, 23 seconds, so every 23 seconds you can just put that down. So that's like every 2 blockade you can re-up your Storm if you're using that. So basically your Storm and Dark Conversion you can cast every other time you're on your back bar. So you do your rotation, you're healing. You also want to make sure you're light weaving on your front bar here. So you can do that and that. So that's kind of generally what you want to do as a healer there. Hope you guys found this video informative. Sorc healers, again, they can make potent healers, but there's a little bit more of a learning curve compared to Templars and Wardens. They do have a very strong burst heal, but their flex spots aren't quite as abundant compared to Templars and Wardens, but they still make very strong healers for 4-man content and even in vet trials. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.